In the spring of 2019, a 26-year-old woman named Rachel sat down at her kitchen table in a small apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, and opened an email that would split her life into a before and an after. The subject line was ordinary. It said, "You have a new DNA match." She had taken the test 6 months earlier as a joke, a birthday gift from a coworker who loved genealogy, the kind of gift you set on a shelf and forget about until curiosity gets the better of you on a slow Tuesday night. She expected third cousins. She expected a pie chart telling her she was 31% Irish. What she got instead was a name she had never heard, flagged in bold red letters as a parent-child match, with a confidence level of 99.9%. She read it 3 times before her hands started shaking. A parent-child match meant one of 2 people. It meant her father, who had died when she was 19. Or it meant her mother, who was very much alive and sitting 40 minutes away in the house Rachel had grown up in. Rachel did not know it yet, but the woman behind that match, a stranger named Karen, had been waiting for this exact notification for 26 years. Karen had uploaded her own DNA to that same website 4 years earlier, not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. On the advice of a private investigator she could no longer afford to pay. She had done it the way a person bails water out of a sinking boat with a coffee cup. Not because she believed it would work, because doing nothing had become unbearable. 26 years earlier, in the summer of 1993, Karen had a daughter, a real, breathing, 3-month-old daughter with a shock of dark hair and a birthmark shaped like a small comma behind her left ear. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in July, that daughter vanished from a bassinet on a screened porch while Karen was folding laundry 20 feet away. No sound, no struggle, no trace. For anyone who has lived in that terrible limbo between desperate hope and crushing grief, you already know that this story does not end with a body, and it does not end with an arrest. It ends, 26 years later, with a stranger's spreadsheet, a stranger's spit sample, and a stranger's daughter, half a country away, who had absolutely no idea she was anyone's daughter but her own mother's. This is the story of what was taken, what was endured, and what, against every reasonable expectation, was finally given back. Before we go further into how this family's world came apart, we have to go back to the beginning, back to who they were before the tragedy split their lives in 2. Karen and her husband David were, by every account of the people who knew them, unremarkable in the best possible way. They were the kind of young couple that other young couples quietly envied without knowing why. David worked as a lineman for the local power company, the kind of job that meant early mornings and a body sore by 3 in the afternoon, but steady work, dependable work, the kind that let a man believe he was building something. Karen taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, 2 miles from their house, a squat brick building with a rusted swing set out front that every kid in town had chipped a tooth on at least once. They had married young, at 22, in a church with folding chairs because the real chairs were being reupholstered that month, and nobody minded because nobody there cared about chairs. They cared about the 2 of them, standing at the front, grinning like the whole world was still ahead of them. It was. In April of 1993, after 2 years of trying and 1 heartbreaking miscarriage that Karen still would not talk about even decades later, she gave birth to a girl. They named her Grace. It was not a fashionable name that year. It was simply the word that kept surfacing in Karen's mind every time she pictured holding her daughter for the first time, and once she held her, the name fit so completely that no other name was ever discussed. Grace was, in the language every new parent reaches for, and every new parent means with their whole chest, perfect. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of dark hair that the nurses joked would need its own comb by kindergarten. That small, comma-shaped birthmark behind her left ear, which Karen would later describe, with a kind of aching precision that only comes from a mother who has spent 26 years replaying every detail, as being roughly the size of a grain of rice, slightly raised, the color of a faded bruise. Their house sat on a quiet residential street lined with maples that had been planted the same year most of the houses were built. A neighborhood where kids rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, and where everyone still knew, more or less, whose car belonged in whose driveway. It was the kind of place people described, without irony, as safe. Karen has said many times over the years that this was the cruelest part of the story to sit with. Not that something terrible happened to her daughter, but that it happened in the one place she had been taught, her entire life, to believe nothing terrible could. That July, the summer Grace turned 3 months old, was hot even by the standards of a town used to hot summers, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the cicadas scream from every tree line. The 4th of July had come and gone the week before, and the neighborhood still smelled faintly of spent fireworks and cut grass. Karen had taken the summer off from teaching, as she did every year, and had settled into a rhythm with her new daughter that felt, for the first time since the miscarriage, like real and uncomplicated happiness. On the afternoon of July 13th, a Tuesday, the temperature climbed past 95 degrees by 2 o'clock. Karen had Grace out on the screened porch at the back of their small ranch house, in a wicker bassinet lined with a yellow gingham blanket that Karen's own mother had sewn. The porch caught a cross breeze that the rest of the house didn't get, and Grace liked it there. She would lie on her back, kicking at nothing, making the small experimental sounds that 3-month-olds make when they're just beginning to discover they have a voice. Karen remembers exactly what her daughter was wearing that day, because she has been asked to describe it so many times over so many years that the description has worn a groove into her memory. A short-sleeved onesie, pale yellow with a row of tiny embroidered ducklings across the chest, a hand-me-down from Karen's sister's daughter, soft from dozens of washes. No shoes, no hat, a single silver bracelet, given to her at birth by Karen's grandmother, engraved with the letter G, so small it barely fit around Grace's wrist, so light that Karen sometimes forgot it was even there. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, Karen carried a basket of laundry from the porch into the small utility room, just off the kitchen, no more than 20 feet from where Grace lay in the bassinet. The screen door between the porch and the utility room was propped open, the way it always was in summer, to keep the cross breeze moving through the house. Karen has told this part of the story so many times that her voice has developed a kind of practiced flatness around it, a flatness that people who don't know her mistake for calm, and people who do know her recognize as the sound of someone holding something enormous, perfectly still. She was gone, she says, no more than 7 minutes, long enough to sort 2 loads of laundry and start the washing machine. She remembers hearing Grace make a soft cooing sound just as she left the porch. She remembers thinking, in the unremarkable, forgettable way you think ordinary thoughts on ordinary days, that she would nurse her again once the laundry was going. When Karen walked back onto the porch, the bassinet was empty. No cry, no sound of the screen door, no sign that anyone had crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, or reached over the low screen railing. No footprints in the flower bed beneath the porch, which investigators would later comb through inch by inch. No tire tracks on the gravel shoulder of the road out front. No neighbor who saw a car idling, a stranger walking, anything at all out of place, on a street where, in a town that size, a stranger walking usually got noticed within minutes. If you have ever walked into a room expecting to find someone you love and instead found only the space where they should have been, you know that there is a specific, physical sensation to that kind of absence. It is not like sadness. It comes first as confusion, a kind of static in the brain that refuses, for several long seconds, to process what the eyes are reporting. Karen has said, in the handful of interviews she gave over the years, that she checked the bassinet 3 times before she understood that checking it a 4th time would not change what was in it. Nothing. Just the yellow gingham blanket, still faintly warm. She screamed for David, who was not yet home from work. She screamed for her neighbor. She ran through the house, then the yard, then the street, barefoot, calling a name that a 3-month-old baby could not possibly answer, even if she'd been standing right there. Grace was gone. Just gone. No body, no keys, no trace. One moment a living, breathing child on a warm porch. The next, a blanket, still holding the shape of her. Before we continue with this shocking story, subscribe and hit the bell. Don't miss any case, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The police arrived within 11 minutes of Karen's call, a number she would remember with the same painful precision as the ducklings on the onesie, because in the retelling of trauma, the mind often clings hardest to the smallest, most useless facts, as if precision could somehow undo what happened. Within the hour, the small local department had called in the county sheriff. Within 3 hours, the FBI had been notified, standard procedure in any case involving a missing infant, though nobody in that house was thinking about procedure. They were thinking about a girl in a yellow onesie who had not yet learned to roll over. The search that followed was, by every measure, thorough. Cadaver dogs worked the property and the surrounding fields for 2 full days, turning up nothing, which brought Karen and David a specific, terrible kind of relief. The relief of ruling out the worst possibility while gaining no ground at all on any better one. Divers searched the retention pond half a mile from the house. Officers went door to door for a 3-mile radius, then 5, then 10, showing a photograph of a baby too young to have grown into any of the features that make a face memorable. Karen and David gave blood samples, background checks, hours upon hours of interviews, the kind of interviews where investigators gently, and then not so gently, probe whether the parents themselves might be involved, because, statistically, tragically, they usually are. Karen and David were not involved. Every polygraph, every alibi, every scrap of evidence confirmed it. They were exactly what they appeared to be, 2 devastated young parents, whose daughter had evaporated from a porch 20 feet away from her own mother. The evaporation is the part of this story that investigators, even decades later, still cannot fully explain. There was no ransom note, which ruled out the kind of kidnapping for profit that at least offers a family a script to follow, a demand to meet, a negotiation to survive. There was no registered sex offender in the area, with a pattern that matched. There was no custody dispute, no jealous relative, no disgruntled ex-employee of David's, no thread that investigators could pull that led anywhere except back to the same maddening dead end. A healthy infant had disappeared from a screened porch, in broad daylight, in full view of a house, a yard, and a street, without leaving so much as a single hair behind. The leading theory, the one that investigators returned to again and again over the years, was that Grace had been taken by someone who wanted a baby of her own. Not a trafficker, not a predator in the way the word usually conjures, but a woman. Statistically, it is almost always a woman, in these particular cases, suffering from her own unbearable loss. A miscarriage, a stillbirth, an inability to conceive, a grief so total that it curdled, in some unthinkable moment, into the belief that another woman's living child could somehow fill the shape of her own absence. It is a theory that offers no comfort, because it does not promise that Grace was safe, only that she may have been wanted, cared for, raised, in a life built entirely on a lie. Over the years that followed, that theory would be tested against dozens of leads, and every single one of them would eventually dissolve into nothing. A psychic contacted the department in 1996. Certain Grace had been taken across state lines in a blue sedan, a detail that led nowhere. A woman in another state called in 1999 convinced her new neighbor's toddler was the missing girl from the news segment she'd seen the year before, a tip that investigators chased for 3 anxious weeks before ruling it out entirely. Most painfully, in 2011, an 18-year-old girl in a neighboring state came forward on her own, having stumbled across Grace's case online and noticing an unsettling resemblance to her own baby pictures, gaps in her own family's account of her early childhood that had always quietly bothered her. Karen and David let themselves hope, fully and without reservation, for the first time in years. They drove 4 hours for a meeting neither of them could sleep the night before. The DNA test that followed excluded her within a week. Karen has said that of everything the search cost her, that particular disappointment came closest to breaking her completely, because for 6 days she had let herself believe the search was finally over, and the return of that specific, singular grief, after finally having set it down, very nearly took something from her that she was not sure she'd get back. What followed for Karen and David was not a single tragedy, but a slow, grinding accumulation of ordinary days made unbearable by an extraordinary absence. The nursery stayed exactly as it was. The yellow gingham blanket was never washed again, sealed instead in a plastic bag at the request of investigators, in case it was ever needed for a scent trail that never came. Flyers went up on telephone poles and in grocery store windows across 3 counties. Grace's 3-month-old face rendered slightly older with each passing year by a police sketch artist trying to imagine what a missing child might look like as she aged, a practice that is equal parts science and heartbreak, guessing at the face of a person no one has seen grow. If you've ever watched someone you love slip into a grief that has no ending, no funeral, no closure, you understand that this kind of loss is its own particular category of suffering. Psychologists have a name for it. They call it ambiguous loss, a grief without a body, without a death certificate, without any of the rituals a culture normally offers to help a person move through pain and eventually past it. Karen and David were denied even that. They were suspended, instead, in a limbo, with no bottom and no visible ceiling, a place where hope and despair took turns wearing each other's clothes. Watched her put up flyers, watched her take them down when the paper yellowed and curled at the edges, watched her put up new ones, watched 9 years pass, then 11, then 19, watched the local police department, understaffed and underfunded, quietly reclassify the case from active to cold, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple mathematics of limited resources chasing an ever colder trail. Watched David take on 2 jobs, then 3, funneling the money toward private investigators who, one after another, over the years, ran out of leads and, eventually, ran out of Karen and David's savings. The town, too, changed around them in the way small towns do, slowly and then suddenly. The elementary school where Karen once taught 3rd grade closed and reopened as a charter school. The power company David worked for was bought out twice. Neighbors who had once organized search parties moved away, or grew old, or simply stopped bringing it up, not because they'd forgotten, but because there is only so long people can sit inside someone else's open wound before their own lives pull them elsewhere. Karen and David stayed. They told themselves, and eventually told each other less and less, that leaving would mean giving up the one address Grace might someday remember, might someday search for, might someday, impossibly, come home to. They did not give up. That has to be said plainly, because it is the single fact that defines the next 2.5 decades of their lives more than any other. Investigators gave up, in the practical, procedural sense that departments eventually must. The town's collective memory gave up, in the way that any community's attention inevitably drifts toward its newest tragedies. But Karen and David never did. Every July 13th, without fail, they released a single yellow balloon into the sky above the house, a small, private ritual that neither of them ever explained to outsiders, and neither of them ever needed to explain to each other. Grace's bedroom stayed exactly as it was in the summer of 1993, the crib still made up with a mobile of felt stars, turning slowly above it whenever a window was left open. Karen dusted it every week for 26 years. She could not have explained why, exactly, except to say that leaving it untouched felt like the last promise she had any power left to keep. Karen and David went on, in the years that followed, to have 2 more children, a son in 1996 and a daughter in 1999, and both of them grew up in a house that loved them completely, while also, quietly, carrying the shape of a sister neither of them had ever met. They knew her face from the photograph on the mantel. They knew her birthday, celebrated every October with a small cake that no one ate, a candle lit and blown out by Karen alone, while her other children watched, old enough by then to understand, without needing to be told twice, that grief in their house was simply a fact of the architecture, as permanent and unremarkable as the load-bearing walls. Watched Karen turn 40, then 50, her dark hair going grey in the specific, premature way that grief seems to accelerate. Watched David's hands grow rougher, his shoulders begin to stoop under the accumulated weight of 30 years spent climbing utility poles, and 26 spent carrying something far heavier than any tool belt. Watched birthdays come and go with no candles blown out by the person they were meant for. Watched Christmas mornings where one stocking hung empty every single year, not because anyone expected it to be filled, but because taking it down felt, to both of them, indistinguishable from giving up. By the time cheap consumer DNA testing kits began appearing on store shelves in the early 2000s, marketed mostly toward people curious about their ancestry, their percentages of this ethnicity or that one, Karen barely paid attention. It seemed at first like a novelty, a toy for people hunting distant cousins and old family trees, not a tool for finding a living, breathing daughter who could be anywhere in the country under any name at all. It was a private investigator, hired in a final, expensive attempt in 2015, who first suggested that Karen and David submit their own DNA to the growing genetic databases that companies like the one Rachel would later use had begun to build. Not because it was likely to work, because it had, in a small handful of other cases across the country, worked before, and because a small handful was infinitely more than zero. Karen submitted her sample in 2015, David followed a year later, and then, for 4 years, nothing happened. No match, no notification. Just the same silence that had defined every other year of their search, now filtered through a slightly more modern, slightly more technological kind of hope, which is, in the end, still just hope, still just as capable of disappointing a person who has already been disappointed more times than any person should have to survive. In the next part, we're going to discover something incredible, something that neither Karen nor the Stranger 4 states away could have possibly predicted. If you want to know what happened next, like this video and share it with someone who loves true stories. Rachel had grown up believing, without a shadow of doubt, that she was exactly who her parents told her she was. Her mother, a woman named Denise, had raised her in a small house outside Columbus, along with a father, Tom, who worked in construction, and who Rachel adored with the uncomplicated devotion of a daughter who has never once had reason to question where she came from. Rachel had a childhood full of ordinary, happy things: bike rides, a dog named Biscuit, a 10th birthday party with a bounce house that collapsed halfway through, which became a family joke told and retold at every holiday for the next 16 years. She had, by every measure that matters to a child, a good life, a loving life, a life with no visible seams. There were, if she looked back later, with the benefit of a devastating new context, a few small things that never quite added up. She did not resemble either of her parents in any obvious way, a fact that family members occasionally joked about at reunions, the kind of joke that gets made about mail carriers and milkmen and never means anything, until suddenly it does. Denise had always been vague, almost evasive, about the details of Rachel's birth, citing a difficult, traumatic delivery that she preferred not to discuss. A story Rachel had simply accepted, the way children accept most things their parents tell them, without interrogation. Because why would a child interrogate her own mother's account of her own birth? Rachel took the DNA test in late 2018 at the suggestion of a co-worker who was building out an elaborate family tree as a hobby, the kind of hobby that had become suddenly popular as testing kits dropped in price and multiplied in availability. Rachel mailed in her sample mostly to be polite, mostly because it seemed like a fun, low-stakes thing to do on a slow weekend, the vial of saliva feeling more like a party trick than the beginning of anything serious. The first results came back unremarkable, a breakdown of ethnicity that roughly matched what she'd always assumed, a handful of third and fourth cousins she'd never heard of, scattered across the Midwest, the kind of distant relations that mean little more than a shared great-great-grandparent and an afternoon of mild curiosity. She closed the app and, for the most part, forgot about it. Then, 6 months later, the notification arrived. A new match. Parent-child relationship. 99.9% confidence. Rachel's first assumption, the only assumption that made any logical sense to her at the time, was that the system had made some kind of error. She had a mother, She had, until his death 7 years earlier, a father. The idea that a database could identify a third parent, a stranger with no name she recognized, made no sense within the framework of the life she had always understood herself to be living. She almost didn't click on it. She has said, in the one interview she eventually agreed to give, that she sat looking at the notification for nearly 20 minutes before she opened it, some instinctive part of her already sensing that whatever was on the other side of that click would not be something she could simply close the app and forget. The profile attached to the match belonged to a woman named Karen. No photograph. A short, careful message, the kind of message written and rewritten a dozen times before being sent, explaining that Karen had lost a daughter in 1993, that the daughter would now be 26 years old, and that if there was any possibility at all, that Rachel might be that daughter, Karen would be endlessly grateful for the chance to speak. Rachel read it standing in her kitchen, and by her own account, felt the floor of her entire identity tilt sideways. She called Denise that same night, her voice, she later admitted, shaking in a way she couldn't fully control. She did not accuse. She did not yet understand enough to accuse. She simply asked, as plainly as she could manage, whether there was anything about her birth that Denise had never told her. The silence on the other end of that call, Rachel has said, lasted long enough that she genuinely wondered if the line had dropped. What emerged over the following weeks, through a combination of Denise's own halting, tearful admissions and a subsequent investigation reopened by the FBI's Ohio field office, was not the story of a trafficking ring or a criminal network, but something smaller, sadder, and in its own way, more human. Denise had suffered 2 stillbirths in the early 1990s. By the summer of '93, she was, by her own later description, no longer entirely herself, consumed by a grief that had begun to warp her sense of what was and was not possible, what was and was not permissible. She has said she does not remember making a decision, in any deliberate sense, to take a child that was not hers. She has described it instead as something closer to a break, a period of time she genuinely cannot fully account for, that ended with a baby in her care, and a story she told herself, and then told everyone else, so many times that it eventually calcified into something she treated, almost, as true. Investigators were never able to fully reconstruct Denise's movements on July 13, 1993, a gap of nearly 300 miles between where she was living at the time and the porch Grace disappeared from, a gap that raised as many questions as it answered, and that Denise herself, even facing charges, could not adequately explain. What was not in question, once the DNA results were confirmed through an official law enforcement sample, rather than a consumer database, was the outcome. Rachel was Grace. The confirmation itself happened in a small, windowless room in a state crime lab, weeks after that first notification from a stranger's database had upended everything. Rachel sat across a metal table from a forensic technician who explained, in the careful, practiced language of someone who has delivered this exact kind of news many times before and never gotten used to it, that a buccal swab would need to be taken from the inside of her cheek, cross-referenced against a sample already on file from Karen and David, submitted decades earlier and kept, all that time, in a case file that had never technically closed. Rachel has said she remembers staring at her own reflection in the small mirror mounted above the sink in that room, trying and failing to see anyone else's face layered underneath her own, some hidden grace she was suddenly expected to recognize in the mirror of a woman she had always simply called herself. The results came back 11 days later. Karen received the call first, standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once folded a basket of laundry 20 feet from an empty bassinet. She has said that when the agent read her the confirmed match probability, a number so close to certainty that it left no rational room for doubt, she did not immediately cry, or scream, or collapse the way she always imagined she might. She simply sat down on the kitchen floor, phone still pressed to her ear, and stayed there for a long time after the call had ended, unable, for those first several minutes, to summon a single word. For Karen and David, the phone call from the FBI field office arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon in October of 2019, 26 years, 3 months, and some number of days after a bassinet on a screened porch had been found empty. Karen has said that when the agent identified himself and asked if she was sitting down, some part of her already knew, in the instant before he said another word, that everything was about to change. She has described the moment that followed not as joy, not exactly, not at first. She has described it as a kind of total, paralyzing collapse, 26 years of accumulated fear and hope and grief arriving all at once, with nowhere left to go except through her, all of it at the same time, so that what came out of her, David has said, was not really crying and not really laughing, but some sound in between the two that neither of them had ever heard her make before, and neither of them has heard her make since. The reunion the world imagines when it hears a story like this one is a fairy tale reunion, a tearful embrace at an airport gate, a daughter running into her mother's arms with the recognition of someone finding her way home. That is not what happened, and if you have ever loved someone who has come back changed, or come back as someone you no longer fully recognize, you already understand why. Rachel was 26 years old. She had a mother, Denise, who she had loved for her entire conscious life, now facing serious criminal charges. She had a father figure in Tom, who investigators eventually concluded had no knowledge whatsoever of the truth, and who was, in his own right, as devastated by the revelation as anyone else in this story, a man discovering in his 50s that the daughter he had raised had been taken from another family before he ever met her. She had, now, an entirely separate set of biological parents she had never met, speaking to her about a childhood she did not remember, using a name, Grace, that meant nothing to her, attached to a person she had never had the chance to become. The first meeting between Rachel and Karen took place at a hotel conference room in Columbus, chosen deliberately as neutral ground by the agents managing the reunification, with a family therapist present at Karen's request, because Karen, even in the middle of the most overwhelming moment of her life, understood enough about trauma to know that this could not simply be treated as a happy ending. It was not, by any account, an easy meeting. Rachel has described feeling, in that room, an almost unbearable pressure to perform a joy and a recognition she simply did not feel, because the woman across from her was, biologically, without question, her mother, and yet was also, in every way that Rachel's actual lived experience could measure, a total stranger. Karen, for her part, has said she had spent 26 years imagining this exact reunion in 1,000 different versions, and none of those versions had prepared her for the specific, quiet devastation of looking at her grown daughter's face and seeing, unmistakably, the same comma-shaped birthmark behind her left ear, while her daughter looked back at her with the polite, careful eyes of someone meeting a kind stranger at a funeral. They did not fall into each other's arms. They shook hands, and then, after a long silence, hugged stiffly, the way two people hug when they are trying to give each other what the moment seems to demand, rather than what either of them is actually feeling. Karen has said that hug lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and that she has replayed those 4 seconds more times than she can count, cataloguing them the way she once catalogued the ducklings on a onesie, because they were, finally, after 26 years, real. What followed was not a homecoming so much as a slow, uncertain courtship between two people who shared blood, shared a birthmark, shared a name that one of them had never used, and shared almost nothing else. Rachel did not move in with Karen and David. She did not take back the name Grace, though Karen has said she catches herself, even now, half-forming the word before correcting herself. Rachel kept her job, her apartment, her friendships, the entire scaffolding of the life she had built as a woman named Rachel, because that scaffolding, however built on a foundation she had not chosen, was still the only life she had ever actually lived. What they built instead, over the following months and then years, was something slower and, in its own way, more honest than the instant, complete reunion the world tends to imagine. Weekend visits, long, halting phone calls, a shared, awkward first Thanksgiving where nobody quite knew what to call anyone else at the table, and where Karen, by her own admission, spent most of the meal simply watching Rachel's hands, the way she held her fork, searching for some echo of the infant she remembered, and finding instead an entirely new person she was only just beginning to know. 2 weeks after that first hotel meeting, Rachel met her younger brother and sister, then 23 and 20, for the first time. They had grown up with a photograph of her on the mantel and a candle lit every October for a sister they had never spoken to. Rachel has described that meeting as somehow easier and harder than meeting Karen had been. Easier because her siblings carried none of the 26 years of accumulated grief that sat behind every one of Karen's glances. Harder because they reached for her with an immediate, uncomplicated warmth, already certain of who she was to them, while Rachel was still, privately, working out who any of them were to her. Her sister hugged her at the door before either of them had said a single word, and Rachel has said that hug, unlike the first stiff embrace with Karen, was the moment she finally understood, on some level deeper than logic, that this was not an investigation concluding. It was a family, however strangely assembled, actually beginning. There was anger in it too, and it would be dishonest to leave that out. Anger that Rachel felt toward Denise, complicated by 26 years of genuine love that did not simply evaporate because the truth had. Anger that Karen felt, quietly, at a universe that had handed her daughter back changed beyond recognition, raised under a stranger's name, carrying a stranger's habits and a stranger's memories, none of which Karen had been there to witness or shape. Grief counselors who worked with the family in the years that followed have spoken, in general terms, about how common this particular anguish is in reunification cases, the specific, disorienting sorrow of getting back a person you love while simultaneously grieving the entire life you never got to have with them. Rachel, for her part, spent much of that first year in a kind of identity limbo of her own, a mirror image of the limbo Karen had lived inside for 26 years. She was not suffering from amnesia in the clinical sense. She remembered every year of her actual childhood with perfect clarity, the bike rides, the dog named Biscuit, the collapsed bounce house. But she had begun, almost against her will, to question the authenticity of nearly all of it, wondering which of her memories belonged to a version of herself built on a stolen foundation, and which, if any, could still be trusted as simply, uncomplicatedly hers. She started seeing a trauma therapist twice a week, a specialist with experience in what the field sometimes calls late discovery identity cases, working through the particular vertigo of learning, in your 27th year of life, that the story of your own birth was a fabrication. She has described the sensation as being handed a second self she never asked for, and being expected, somehow, to introduce it to everyone she loved. She kept the name Rachel throughout this process, a decision she has said was never really a decision at all, simply a fact too large to argue with. Grace was a name that belonged to a person she had no memory of being. Rachel was not a costume she could take off. It was, however strange the circumstances of its origin, still her. And yet, slowly, something did take root. Karen has said that the turning point, for her, came almost a year into their relationship, on a Tuesday afternoon, unplanned, when Rachel called her not out of obligation or scheduled visitation, but simply because something funny had happened at work, and Rachel had, without thinking about it, wanted to tell her mother. Karen has said she sat in her kitchen after that call and cried for 20 minutes, not from grief this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being, for the first time in 26 years, someone's mother in the present tense, rather than the past. For anyone who has ever loved someone through a version of them that no longer quite matches the person you remember, you understand that love does not require the return of what was lost. It only requires the willingness to meet what remains, exactly as it now is, and to call that enough. Denise was ultimately charged and, following a plea agreement, served a sentence for kidnapping, a legal reckoning that offered Karen and David a form of justice that had been denied to them for 26 years, though justice, they have both said, felt smaller and less satisfying than either of them had once imagined it would. It did not return the years, it did not return the childhood. It answered a question that had haunted them for nearly 3 decades, and in true crime stories, An answer is sometimes the closest thing to peace that reality is willing to offer. Today, Karen and David and Rachel are still, by anyone's honest account, learning each other. There is no tidy ending here. No scene where the pain of 26 years is neatly resolved by a single reunion, because that is not how endurance works, and it is not how families, broken and rebuilt, actually function once the cameras and the headlines move on. What there is, instead, is a relationship, imperfect and evolving, built one Tuesday phone call at a time, one awkward holiday at a time, one small act of showing up at a time. Karen still releases a yellow balloon every July 13th. Rachel has, for the last 2 years, been there to watch it go. Last year, without being asked, she brought a second balloon of her own and let it go beside her mother's, watching 2 small points of yellow shrink into the same patch of sky until neither of them could tell one from the other anymore. Denise, for her part, has expressed remorse through her attorneys, though Rachel has said she is still, even now, working through what forgiveness might eventually look like, if it ever fully arrives at all. Tom, the man who raised her believing every day that he was simply her father, still calls her every Sunday. Rachel has said she does not know how to categorize what he is to her now, only that she has no interest in finding out by loving him any less. If there is a lesson in this story, and we believe there is, it is not that DNA tests are magic, or that every missing person's story ends this way, because the devastating truth is that most do not. It is that hope, even the exhausted, threadbare hope of 2 parents who had every rational reason to give up decades earlier, is never entirely wasted. It is that a mother's endurance, sustained across 26 years of silence, can still, against every statistical likelihood, find its way to an answer. And it is that a family, however shattered, however changed by the years it lost, can still choose, deliberately and repeatedly, to become a family again. Share this video, not for morbidity, but to create awareness about thousands of missing persons who are still out there tonight, still unaccounted for, still loved by someone who has never stopped looking. Because sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, against 26 years of silence and a case gone cold, miracles do happen. And sometimes, they arrive in the form of a spit sample and an email with a subject line as plain and as world-altering as, "You have a new DNA match."